Our lesson is going to be coming from Romans chapter 2 today. So if you still have your Bibles open from the scripture reading a moment ago, go and put a bookmarker there as we're going to be taking a look at Romans chapter 2. And specifically, we will be studying verses 1 through 11 today. Romans chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Before we get to our specific text, I want to talk a little bit about the background of the book of Romans itself, because I think that background provides some context for why Paul writes what he writes in chapter 2. First of all, the church in Rome was originally made up mostly of Jews. These are Jews who had been converted to Christ. These are people who were raised Jewish. They were ethnically Jewish. They had Jewish traditions and Jewish customs and Jewish morality, but they learned who Jesus was. And convicted by the gospel message, they became Christians. Christians, right there in the capital city of the great Roman Empire. But the Emperor Claudius, as alluded to in Acts chapter 18 and verse 2, and attested by secular history as well, ordered all the Jews to leave the city of Rome. He didn't want to have anything to do with them anymore. Get out. You're all not welcome anymore. So all the Jews who had been living in Rome, the city, all had to leave. They had to flee, go settle else somewhere. Now, in the time period while these Jews were gone from Rome, because they were eventually allowed to return to their homes in Rome a few years later, but while they were gone, this fledgling congregation of Christians in Rome was really just made up of the Gentiles that were left behind. Gentile being a term that means non-Jewish. People from the nations outside the Jewish nation. And so this small group of Gentile Christians who were left in the city of Rome, well, wouldn't you know it, they started to preach the gospel, and they grew, and they grew, and they grew. And so this church, which was originally a mostly Jewish convert congregation, was now a mostly Gentile, if not entirely Gentile convert congregation. And when the Jews were allowed to return home eventually to Rome, these Jewish Christians came back to the church in Rome and looked around and realized, wait a minute, the demographics of this congregation are very different than when we were here last time. When we used to be here a few years ago, this was a mostly Jewish convert congregation. We all shared that Jewish background, our customs, our traditions, our diet even. And now we look around, and in the time that we've been gone, this is an entirely Gentile congregation. And now we're the minority here. It's all these Gentiles now who outnumber us in the Roman church. And that realization of this demographic shift, I think, was a very discomforting thing to the Jewish Christians who had come back to Rome. And that is what the letter to the Roman church is all about. This book that was written by Paul as a letter to this church is all about finding a way to bridge the gap between Jewish Christians. These are people, again, ethnically, traditionally raised Jewish, but they've become Christians now. And Gentile Christians who were raised pagan and immoral and doing all the stuff that pagans do in pagan temples, and now they're Christians also. So how do you take people from very different backgrounds, very different walks of life, but who share the faith in Jesus Christ? How do you bring these two groups together and convince them that they are actually one and not divided? That's what Romans is all about. In a nutshell, the first two chapters of Romans are this, and I know most of us are very familiar with Romans, but again, if you're not familiar with Romans, if you're new to the Bible, I'm just going to give you the short version of the first two chapters. It's this: the Gentile way of life is disgusting and abhorrent and morally bankrupt, and God rightly judges them for their sins. But if you're a Jewish convert and you're a moralist, who are you to point fingers when you've also committed your own sins? Maybe they're very different sins than the Gentiles, but you still have sin nevertheless. And so God that is, shows absolutely no partiality between Jew and Gentile because we all are sinners. So you need to be very careful who you judge. And you'd be very careful about how that judgment manifests itself. Let me read just the last few verses of chapter 1 as kind of a lead up to get to chapter 2, just for context sake. And this will give you a sense of the Gentile Christians in the church. This was their background, okay? This is the way they lived. When they were Roman, pagan, immoral people, this is what their life was like. And this is how far they've come as far as being Christians now. Read the last few verses here. Romans chapter 1 and verse 28. Okay, Romans chapter 1 verse 28. We'll go to the end of the chapter. It says, "And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They're gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but they also give hearty approval to those who practice them." And this is a terrible chapter break, by the way, because it's not meant to be the end of a thought. It's actually meant to be the introduction to this thought. So he starts chapter 2 by saying, "Therefore, you are without excuse, every man of you who passes judgment. For in that you judge another, you condemn yourself. Or you who practice, or you who judge, practice the same things." Look at the contrast that's being drawn. It is very easy for us. I'm going to make the application real up front here. It's very easy for us to look at a lost world and go, nasty, sickening, abhorrent. All the sinners out there doing their sinful things. You won't believe what I saw on the news the other day. They did a report about San Francisco, California. It's like a modern-day Sodom and Gomorrah, I tell you. And we can come together in a nice building with air conditioning and brand new carpet and linen jackets. And it is very easy for us to look at a lost and dying world and go, that's just disgusting. It's a good thing we're not like that. It's a good thing we've been insulated from that by our Christian heritage. But look at what Paul says to begin chapter 2. And I love this. Right after spending almost all of chapter 1 laying into nasty, disgusting Gentile sins, he starts chapter 2 by going, "And who are you to judge? You think you're so special because you weren't raised going to pagan idols temples with temple prostitutes, celebrating the god Bacchus. He's literally the god of drinking parties. So because you weren't raised doing that, you're so high and mighty, you sit on your pedestal. Who are you to judge someone else?" Now I know he says because you practice the same things, but I'm going to get to that a little bit later in the lesson, because the immediate argument is, I have never murdered anybody. So come on, Paul, be a little more reasonable with me here. I was always respectful to my parents. So how can you say, you who practice the same things, when I can read this list in Romans 1 and maybe some of them, I guess, but most of those things, I've never done it. So hold off. We'll get to that in just a minute. But you are without excuse. The idea there, as he introduces it, is with judgment comes the presumption of knowledge. If you're going to judge someone else, what you're basically saying is, I know what I'm talking about. I have the right to judge you. If you're going to judge someone else's cooking, well, you better know how to cook yourself. If you're going to judge someone else's home repair job, you go have dinner at someone else's house and you're popping open the bathroom sink to look under at the plumbing. Hey, I thought I was bad at plumbing. You should see Joe. But if you're going to judge someone else, what you're basically saying is, I know what I'm talking about, therefore I have the right to judge you. That's true of plumbing, it's true of cooking, it's also true of spiritual things and moral things. Who are you? Who are you to judge someone else? Well, I'm a Jewish Christian. I was raised going to Hebrew school. I knew the law. I've been reading the scrolls my whole life. Every Sabbath day, going to the synagogue. I've lived a moral life, a clean life. I've obeyed all of God's commandments. It's kind of like what Peter says in Acts chapter 10 when he's presented with all the unclean things to eat, and God says, eat this, eat this, eat this. And he's like, no, never. I have never touched an unclean thing. I've never eaten any of that stuff before. This audience in Romans chapter 2 is sitting here saying, I am a good person. I'm a good person. I'm a moral person. I know God. I know the scriptures. And maybe that makes me feel like I'm qualified to go and judge everybody else. Now, he says in verse 2, and we know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. I want to be clear about something, as I think Paul is being clear. This like tonal shift from chapter 1 to chapter 2 is in no way excusing the Gentile sinners from chapter 1. I think sometimes we have like this reflexive response. When we look at sinners of the world and we kind of get high and mighty, someone says, hey, judge not lest you be judged. Who are you to judge? Well, Paul is very clear about something. He says, okay, you got to deal with your problem, but that doesn't mean that they have an excuse. The righteous judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. I want to be clear about this. Sin is sin is sin. And there's no getting around it. And if I am a judgy Charlie Church, that doesn't make it okay for you to keep sinning. You can't just sit there and say, you're a hypocrite, therefore it makes everything I do okay, because you're a hypocrite. Okay, I'm a hypocrite. That's my problem, and I'm going to be judged for that. But if you're an adulterer, you're still an adulterer, no matter how much of a hypocrite I am. If you're a drunkard, you're still a drunkard, no matter how much of a hypocrite I am. If you're a murderer, you're still a murderer, no matter how much of a hypocrite I am. And I love that he points that out in verse 2, is like, okay, all right, hoity-toity, snobby people, I'm going to get to you, but let's not forget, sin is still sin, and the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. But, did you miss it? The judgment of God rightly falls on them. The judgment of God is an important distinction between the judgment of Ryan and the judgment of God rightly falls upon them. So in verse 3, do you suppose this, O man, when you pass judgment upon those who practice such things and then do the same yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? Don't assume that God is too busy judging terrorists and serial killers that he doesn't have the mental bandwidth to worry about you. I think it's like, I'll just fly under the radar. Do you think that you will escape the judgment of God? Because, well, I'm definitely not as bad as most people. And while God is over here with like Adolf Hitler on his hands, he's going to have to deal with Adolf Hitler and all the Adolf Hitlers of the world. Do you think that you're going to escape by kind of, like flying under the radar over here morally and spiritually? Does God have enough power and mental bandwidth? Does God have enough knowledge and enough power and authority to know what you are doing and what you are up to? Or as he says in verse 4, do you think lightly of the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that the kindness of God leads you to repentance? That, to me, that is a real stabbing verse. I think of all the things that Paul says in this chapter, that one I think stings me right up near the top. Do you think lightly of the riches of his kindness? Let's ask that question of ourselves. Let's make the application. Let's think about us, you, me, here, right now. Do you think lightly of the riches of God's kindness? What I mean by that is, was it easy for God to save you? When God looked at Ryan Goodwin, and he kind of judges Ryan Goodwin, he goes, oh, Ryan Goodwin? Oh, no, easy case. Oh, he requires maybe a pinprick of Jesus' blood. I mean, Ryan was already a good guy. He was already a good man before he ever even learned the gospel. So it really doesn't take much to save Ryan. I mean, it takes a lot to save all the other yucky sinners out there. But Ryan was he was a pretty easy case. Do you think it just took a pinprick from Jesus to save you? Do you take lightly the riches of his kindness, as if God is really, if you think about it, kind of lucky to have me? And we all know from the Gospel of Luke the parable that Jesus told about the tax collector and the Pharisee who were both praying in the temple. I know I say this parable all the time. It's because it strikes me so much. It hits me so close to home. I can't help but rely so much on this parable when I assess myself and my attitude toward morality and goodness and God's mercy. The Pharisee's up there saying, God, I thank thee that I'm not like other men. I tithe and I do all the right stuff and I follow the law. And I mean, you're just you're lucky to have me on your side. I'm definitely not like that. Oh, like that tax collector. That one right back there. That tax. God, you're lucky I'm not like that tax collector. And the tax collector's in the back. He couldn't even lift his eyes up to heaven. He says, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. Do you think lightly of God's grace? Or do you believe that it took the full weight of the experience on the cross, that it took the best of heaven, that it took all of the love of God to save you? I think it was hard for God to save me. And it was hard for God to save you. Now, he loves us. But sending his son to this world to live out a ministry and to die on that cross, given the fact of the misery and woe of the man of sorrows, I don't think any of us can look at Jesus and go, but it didn't take that much blood to save me. Jesus said, Luke chapter 7, another point here. And I don't want to deviate too much from Romans 2, but I thought this passage in Luke chapter 7 was appropriate here. Luke chapter 7 and verse 40. Jesus answered this man Simon. He said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he replied, say it, teacher. A certain moneylender had two debtors. One of them owed 500 denarii, and the other only 50. When they were unable to repay the debt, he graciously forgave both of them. Now, which of them loves him more? And Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. And he said, you have judged correctly. The attitude of the person who says, I didn't have much for God to forgive in the first place, that's the attitude of the person who really doesn't think he needs God that much. And that's not any of us. Paul the Apostle, when he was Saul of Tarsus before he became a Christian, Saul of Tarsus was a pretty moral. I would assume that Saul of Tarsus was a real moralist who had his life together, his act together. He kept the law. He was a Pharisee as to zeal toward the law, a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Benjamite. He's got this whole laundry list of things on his spiritual resume that by all accounts, he was a really, really moral good man. And yet of himself, he says in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 12, that he was the greatest sinner of all. So I guess we'll go back to Romans 2 and ask again, who are you, O man? Who are you? Now, verse 5 of Romans chapter 2, he says in verse 5, but because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up for yourself wrath in the day of revelation and wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. So he pinpoints it. It's a heart problem is what it boils down to. You know, for God, as well as for Paul, as he's explaining it here, it's a lot less about the actual, like, gross number of sins that have been committed. God doesn't see it in, like, quantity. What he's looking at is right here. And maybe you and I, like, in this room, let's be real about this. Let's be real. We're at church on Sunday. Probably there's not very many axe murderers in this room right now. We're probably all fairly moral people. Like, we're probably relatively really good people as far as human beings are concerned on planet Earth in the year 2024. We're all pretty good people. But God isn't looking at, like, the sheer quantity. Like, well, this person has 100 sins and this person only has, like, 2. What he's looking at is, what is your heart? And if you have a stubborn and unrepentant heart, you are storing up just as much wrath for yourself in the day of wrath and revelation as anybody else. It's still wrath. like because you're and think about that. You don't have to be a murderer to have wrath. You just have to be stubborn. Stubbornness gets you wrath from God. And it's about changing the heart. We don't have time to look at this, but this is a sermon all its own. But Ezekiel 36, in this really, really beautiful prophecy about the coming of the Messiah and what that's going to look like and what that's going to do for us. And it has happened now, and we are now living out the manifestation of what the Messiah did in the cross and his resurrection. But in Ezekiel 36, it talks about how God wants to remove the dead heart of stone from his people and replace it with a living and vibrant heart. So I guess I would just caution you about the stubbornness and the unrepentant heart that is such a problem for us. Now, he goes on in verse 6, he says, who will render to every man according to his deeds. And this is where I want to go back to a question that I addressed earlier. The contrast is, nasty Gentile, grew up pagan, went to pagans' temples, did all the gross stuff, and moral Jew who just only needed to learn about Jesus to become a Christian. That's it. So there's this like contrast here. The yucky Gentile and the moral Jew. And his whole argument that he's making is, who are you? You're without excuse. You judge others and you practice the same things. And I can imagine the objection of the moral Jew saying, how dare you? I am not a murderer. I am not insolent. I don't hate God. I'm not an adulterer. I don't meet with temple prostitutes as a part of national Roman religion. I don't offer sacrifices to Caesar as if he's a living God. How dare you tell me that I practice the same things as those people? So does Paul have a leg to stand on? Is his statement correct when he says, who are you to judge another when you do the same things? When it seems like kind of on the outside, they're not really doing all the same things. Well, this is where we go back to the heart. We keep going back to it because it's important. It's about the heart. At the heart of every sin, there is one sin that connects them all. I think you know where I'm going to go with this. But whether it's lying, just a little white lie, lying to your boss, lying to your spouse. Maybe it's lying. Maybe it's sexual abuse, manipulation, rebellion. How about greed or covetousness? Murder, witchcraft, defrauding, child sacrifice. These all look like very different sins, don't they? Like murder is very, very different from covetousness. Spousal abuse is very, very different from greed. They all look like really, really different sins on the outside. They're all packaged very differently. Different color, different taste, different smell, different consequences. I get that. But at the core of every single sin, there is one super sin that connects them all. And it's selfishness. It's selfishness. Do you know what ultimately is the motivation behind all of these other sins? Is self. Self-interest, self-preservation, self-aggrandizement. It's selfishness. At the heart of all of it, it is selfishness. And I'll give you another example, James chapter 3. I think actually on my next slide I'm supposed to have that one up, but I'm going to get ahead of myself here because this is where I want to say it. Look at James chapter 3. And if you pick up in verse 13 of James 3, the writer James actually says very similar to what Paul is saying in Romans 2. He says, "Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, and demonic." And verse 16 is the key. "For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there's disorder in every evil thing." Look what he's saying here. He's saying where you have this like basic selfishness, jealousy and selfish ambition, in a nutshell, that's selfishness. Where selfishness exists, he says, there is disorder and every evil thing. The reason why every other evil thing exists is because of the presence of selfishness. When you are selfish, it opens the door for all of these other sins. Let me give you a practical kind of analogy to help us understand this. I'm going to put a list of things up on the screen that all seem like very, very different things, okay? Have nothing to do with each other. Handful of edamame beans, soy sauce, chocolate candy bars, candles, chewing gum, vitamin supplements, crayons, and hand lotion. You might have, if all those things were in a basket in front of you, you'd be like, well, there's nothing that connects these things. So you eat some of them, you apply some of them, you burn some of them, like there's nothing whatsoever that connects these things, right? Until you realize that soy can be found in all of them. Now, I'm not saying every candle has soy, but there are candles that have soy oil in them. I'm not saying every vitamin supplement has soy, but soy can be used. I'm not saying every candy bar has it, but soy lecithin is in most chocolate candy bars at the grocery store. So what I'm saying is, you can find soy in examples of every single one of these things. And while you might argue that a vitamin supplement is very different from a candy bar, if you are deathly allergic to soy, the end result is the same thing. You could say a soy-based candle is clearly very different than a handful of edamame beans. But if you're deathly allergic to soy, it's all the same in the end. And so it is with sin. Murder is not adultery. Greed is not sexual abuse. Profanity, go down the whole list. Profanity is not stealing. But if selfishness is the key ingredient in all of them, then it doesn't matter if you're just kind of a greedy person. But at least I'm not a murderer. Or, well, I like to look at women, but I never sleep with them. It doesn't matter. Because we are deathly allergic to sin, no matter what form it comes in. Just like someone who's deathly allergic to soy, eating a handful of edamame beans, having a candy bar, putting hand lotion on and burning a candle, in the end, if you're deathly allergic to soy, you're going to know it. And so God cares about what you're seeking. And I actually think I'm going to turn this into its own sermon in a couple weeks because I really like this concept. We're out of time today. So I'll end on this idea, and it kind of connects with what we're saying about sin. This is the reason why God shows no partiality between the nasty Gentile who's a convert to Christ and the moralistic traditional Jew who is a convert to Christ. This is why God shows no partiality, as he points out in verse 11, or there is no partiality with God, because God sees beyond the packaging, the packaging of the soy, the packaging of the chocolate bar or the candle or the hand lotion. God sees beyond the packaging of the moralist and the other convert, the formerly deeply sinful convert, and God says, all I see are sinners who need to be led to repentance. and to have a co-equal need for my grace. And whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, whether you're rich or you're poor, whether you were raised in the church or not, it took the same sacrifice on the cross to save us all. So I'll ask the same thing again that Paul does. Who are you, O man, to judge another when you've been practicing the same thing? If you're not a Christian here this morning, it's afternoon now. Sorry, 4 minutes late. I can take 4 minutes, right? If you're not a Christian here this afternoon, you really ought to be. Because right now, you're lost. And I don't care how good you are. I mean, I care how good you are because all the things being equal, I'd rather interact with good people than not. But when it comes to your salvation, it doesn't matter how good of a person you are, how nice you are, how neighborly you are. You're not saved. And you need to be saved. If you want to go to heaven and you want to live that eternal existence in the presence of your Creator, you need to be saved, and you can only be saved in Jesus Christ. So I offer at this time the same invitation that's been offered for 2,000 years now to all who would listen to it. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. Mark 16, verse 16. So if you have any spiritual need at all, then please let that need be known by coming forward as we stand and sing together.